Well, good morning. I am very grateful to be here, just to be able to talk with you about a subject that is very important to me, and it is open and honest. And this is a subject that has been transformative and life-changing for me personally at many levels. My name is Randy McDougal, and many of you know my wife, Abigail, and Abigail has been the person that God has used most in my life to understand about open and understand about honest and the impact that it has on me and my life. So I'd want to share with you a little bit about that impact, but first I want to just ask you to do just a quick activity where you think about this morning and think about one word that describes your morning. As honest as you're comfortable being with that. Once you have that word, I just want you to take a quick moment, turn and look at your neighbor, and just share that word. And as somebody shares that word, just look at them and listen to that word that describes their morning. And then switch to the other person. So go ahead and take a moment and do that now. All right, so that right there kind of starts our morning of just a really simple way of being honest with those who are around us. Now, I said one word, and y'all are continuing to go, so I'm going to bring you back in a little bit. So hopefully you can talk more about that after the service. But one of the reasons I wanted to ask you to do that is just so you can begin to have some communication with one another in an honest way, and also to see that honest is very simple. At the same time, I'll say honest, and we'll also look at open. While they may be simple, they're not easy. Sometimes they're terribly difficult. And so we're going to just walk through some of the simple things that God has taught me and challenged me, and look at verses in Proverbs in the Bible about what God says about these concepts. And so first I want to just talk about how it's impacted me, and this is really where I'm going in this message. And you can see it says, relationships with open and honest communication bring the light and life of Jesus to, and there's a whole list. Some of the specific ones for me, one of the biggest ones, well, really the biggest, is in my marriage. In our families, and seeing the impact there, in our work, how I work and how I interact with those who I work with, in the church and the relationships we have in our community here, and really in our lives, in all areas of our lives. It's a huge impact. And so I'm going to walk through open and honest and kind of tease apart what those are, because sometimes we just throw words together and we can hear things like, let's be open and honest. And one thing that really helped me out is when somebody said to me, open and honest are completely different. And what really helped me in that is it just began to spin in my brain thinking, okay, if they're completely different, I can start to tease apart and say, okay, how can I be really good at being open? And then how can I be really good at being honest? And then you see the second bullet on there says, open and honest are completely interdependent. And that may sound a little bit strange. They're completely different and completely interdependent. And so a metaphor I love, I don't know if I'm the first person in Midtown to use a spear on a Sunday morning, so this is a lot of fun. This is a metaphor that I really have come to appreciate. And I'm going to ask Jonathan. He volunteered. He would help me out. He actually didn't know what he was volunteering for, but he didn't know he's going to be at the end of a spear. Yeah, still doesn't know what he volunteered for. This is a metaphor that has helped me to understand the relationship of open and honest. So if this is open and this is honest on that end, where Jonathan is, and I learned this several years ago going through some marriage counseling in which we were and continue to really work on our marriage. And Dr. Marlene, she shared this concept. And honestly, I didn't get it. It took me several weeks before I began to get it. But as I understood, if this is the open end of the spear, and that's the honest end of the spear, you notice they're both very sharp. Now, sharp doesn't mean they're always painful, but they're always sharp. And that's a big thing to understand. When we enter into open and honest, it's helpful just to understand there's always some sharpness to it and be aware of that. So if I say to Jonathan, hey, Jonathan, I'm very open. I want you to be completely honest with me. What I'm doing is I'm asking him to start walking towards me and taking steps towards me. And if he says, hey, I really like your car, I'm like, great, keep coming. If he says, Randy, you got spinach in your teeth, I'm like, ooh, that's kind of embarrassing. And maybe I resist a little. But if he says, Randy, when you said that to me the other day, it really hurt. And I'm really mad about it. All of a sudden, my defenses start going up, and now it's starting to hurt. And if I'm here saying I'm open, and I suddenly grab this and I start pushing it back on him, where does the sharp end go? It goes right into him, right? And this is what happens over and over in our relationships. It's happened so many times in my marriage with Abigail. It's happened with my kids in my interaction. It's happened in work situations, in church situations, where people, I tell them I'm open, and they are honest with me, but then I push back, and suddenly, Jonathan's feeling some pain now. You can't tell if that really hurts on the other end. He's got this. He feels that pain. So tomorrow when I come to him, I say, hey, Jonathan, I'm really open. I want you to be honest with me. He's got those scars that he's remembering, and he says, I'm not going to go to certain places with Randy. And suddenly at some point, our relationship just shuts down a little by little by little by not going there in the relationship. All right, thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate you being at the other end of that spear. At the same time, if I were to put him at the other end, him at the open end and me at the honest end, I have to understand I have a real responsibility on the honest side, because sometimes I have some things that I'm convinced are true, and I just take them and I just go jab them, and I start jabbing into somebody because I say, well, it's true, isn't it? And in Proverbs, it talks about that our words can be like a sharp sword. They can dig in and really hurt someone deeply. So we need to be good at both the honest side and, got it wrong, on the open side and the honest side of this spear. So that's what we're going to do, is just walk through some simple questions, 3 questions about open that have really helped me, and 3 questions about honest that have really helped me. And on the, let's see, it is not clicking. Am I hitting the wrong button? Can you help me out there? There, okay, open, thank you. So the 3 questions that really help me when I'm on the open side is to ask myself first, am I open to listen? And that may seem very basic. Obviously, we need to be able to listen. If we're not able to listen, then that is not really open. The second question is a little bit harder for me. It makes me a little more nervous. Am I open to be vulnerable? Am I open to be vulnerable with the other person? And then the third question is, am I open to be different? Sometimes people say, well, isn't open to listen the same as open to be different? My experience is no. There's times where I'll say, hey, I'm here, I'm taking notes, I'm listening, but inside, if you ask me to be different, my arms are crossed, and I say, I don't know, that's a little bit too tough. I'm not sure I'm going to go there. So we're going to dig into each of these, and am I open to listen? Look at a couple of verses on those and talk through some examples of what it looks like or what it doesn't look like. And in Proverbs 19, it simply says, listen to advice and accept discipline so that you may be wise the rest of your days. And that's what I think most of us really want, is we want to be wise. And so it says very clearly to start by listening. And we learned in James last spring, everyone must be quick to hear. Now, I'll give you an example. It was a work situation where somebody in the room gave me some feedback, and I was on the outside looking like I was listening. But on the inside, because they were talking about some of my actions that didn't quite represent some values that I really hold in high esteem, on the inside, I was coming up with all these explanations and justifications of why what this person said wasn't right. So I wasn't really open to listen. While on the outside I might have been slow to speak, on the inside I was speaking a mile a minute, explaining why what this person was saying. And I was even picking apart the way they said it, as opposed to saying, every time somebody tells me something in our humanness, they're probably going to say it incorrectly. I need to dig in and say, what is it God has for me that I can listen to? Next, am I open to be vulnerable? Last week, Michael talked about pride and humility, and one of the big blockers for me, and I think for most of us, is pride. And that's really, it talks about right here in Proverbs 16, that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before stumbling. And vulnerability really challenges and breaks down that pride. And then in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul talks about, most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, my vulnerabilities, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. For me, that helps me so much to say, can I share and be vulnerable? And a great example of this is, again, a work situation where there was a group together, and as we were starting off, one of the men just shared a little bit of how he was doing. And it was very simple. He simply said, we had a great weekend with my daughter, having a really good conversation, because that's really been painful lately. Very simply and quickly, he was vulnerable. And that created an openness in the room that turned into an opportunity to be honest with one another that was really transformative. Another example of vulnerability in my marriage is that Abigail is really great, and has been over the years, at just sharing her dreams, her hopes, the simple ones, the big ones, but also her fears. Things that I just don't feel comfortable sharing. And as I've learned to imitate that example, it has really brought a much greater closeness for us. And I see it in other examples when I come on a Sunday morning of how that impacts. When I'm with people in work situations, when I'm with neighbors, all these different situations, just asking, how can I have some vulnerability of just seeing a little bit more inside of me? So open to listen, open to be vulnerable, and then open to be different. And this one, it's very simple in Proverbs 4. When God shows us something through somebody else or through a scripture, am I ready to turn my foot? Am I ready to change and be different in that situation? Romans 12 challenges us. Don't be conformed. Another way I would say it is, don't be stuck in our ways, but be transformed, ready to be different by the renewing of our mind. And it's talking about according to what the will of God is in our life. And I had a lunch with a couple of people. They invited me to lunch, and it was a very interesting situation. They wanted to hear my thoughts on some things that I've done a lot of deep study on, and they were asking me questions. I was asking them questions back. We were interacting, and through the conversation, what I started observing is every time I shared something, there would start to be a justification where they would explain to each other how they were really doing just fine in all those things. And it became, at the end of the conversation, there was just a sadness on me, because while they came to listen and ask questions, they didn't come to be different at the end of the conversation. But what was really sad for me, as I walked away from that, I realized how many times I've done that in conversations, whether it's lunches, discussions, a Sunday morning, a Bible study, time with my children, time with my wife, and just really challenged myself of how can I come into every situation and say, how can I be different? What does God want different for me? So those are the three questions on open to really help us in our relationships. Am I open to listen? Am I open to be vulnerable? Am I open to be different at the end of that discussion? So we're going to come back to these at the end and just take a few moments to pray on each of these. But I want to now shift over and talk about honest. And the three questions that have really helped me out in honest are, am I 100% truthful in a situation? And being 100% truthful, that is a lot of hard work. In fact, it's really hard work. One of the biggest challenges that I have every day when I get up It's just spending some time saying, am I being 100% truthful just with myself about my desires, my hopes, my fears, the things I'm angry about, the things I'm happy about? And then can I take that and be 100% truthful with people? At the same time, am I 100% kind? And this is also very challenging. Sometimes we look at this and people will use the word balance, balancing truth and kindness, because they're both hard. I encourage us to eliminate that word balance. God doesn't balance truth and kindness, because to me that implies I'm going to lower my kindness so I can tell you what I really think, or I'm going to lower my truth to be kind, at least in my own mind. And God really challenges us. He is 100% truthful, and he is creative enough to be 100% kind in the way he does that over and over. And so that is a huge challenge to me we'll dig into. And then third, am I curious? And curious for me helps me to say, am I being humble here? I so often tend to want to think I've got all the answers in a situation because they sure make sense in my own mind. So let's dig in a little more. Am I 100% truthful? In Proverbs 14, it says, a truthful witness saves lives. That's an amazing statement. But he who utters lies is treacherous. And I'm really challenged with that because there's often times where I don't quite want to go there with somebody. I don't want to tell them the true reason why we made this decision or that decision. The true reason. I see it happen in the church, in the family, in work situations, in neighbor situations. So it's learning to really be 100% truthful. And in Ephesians 4, it says, therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbor. This is really important, for we are members of one another. It almost says that if I'm not speaking the full truth with somebody, I'm lying to myself, because we're members of one another. Next, am I 100% kind? I love this illustration in Proverbs 25, like apples of gold in settings of silver. It's a word spoken in right circumstances. Like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. What a beautiful picture, right? And this really brings together, it's not only being clear on the truth, but it's saying it in the right circumstances. That's understanding really, who should I say it to? What needs to be said and when it needs to be said. And then in Ephesians 4:15, again, the same concept that we were looking at just a minute ago. In the other verse in Ephesians 4, it says, but speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into him who is the head, even Christ. This helps me so much to think, just because I'm telling somebody something that's really right, if I'm not doing it in love, I am not helping them nor myself to grow up in all aspects into Christ. Then, am I curious? Now, just to be really clear on this, when I say am I curious, what we're talking about is, am I asking questions that really help me and help the person involved? I'm not talking about asking questions in terms of gossip and rumors and trying to kind of bring up a bunch of those things, but specifically in a situation, it is so easy for me to hear a few bits and have a few snapshots and think, I know exactly what's going on, and I just drive right in with my thoughts. Proverbs 20 challenges, though, that the plan or what's in the heart of a man, it's a deep water. And usually what I see doesn't get to that deep water. But a person of understanding, a man of understanding, draws it out. I want to be that person of understanding. I want to learn how to draw it out, how to be really good at asking those questions that are so critical and important, both to help me, because sometimes I learn things I had no idea I needed to learn, but also to help them so they are going to God and they are trusting the Holy Spirit and digging into the Scriptures, which is what Acts 17 talks about, that those in Thessalonica were more noble-minded. They received the word with eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. And that's what we want to be an example of being curious, both asking and understanding what's inside those around us as well as ourselves, just like Kara was talking about in those verses. and also asking, God, what do you say? And really digging in there. So the 3 questions of honest, again, to think about, what does God want each of us to learn? How can I improve on being 100% truthful? How can I improve in being 100% kind? And how can I do a better job of the humility of being curious? So I want to bring this together with a couple of verses that are really powerful for me personally. This is kind of long in Ephesians 5. I just want to walk through a little bit at a time. It says, do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead even expose them. And I appreciate that it's just as a reminder, I don't want to participate. And it's kind of challenging at the end, but even expose them. And then he says, for it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. And this is really powerful, this next one. But all things become visible when they are exposed by the light. And part of me says, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. When you expose things to light, they become visible. For everything that becomes visible is light. Everything I bring to the presence of Jesus and his forgiveness and his salvation through what he did on the cross becomes light in my life. And then it ends with, for this reason it says, awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. And I listen to that and think, wow, I have been a sleeper for most of my life. I've known God through Jesus a number of years. But I've also got a lot of things that I've been a sleeper on. I haven't recognized. Some of them tying back to my childhood, some in my teen years, young adult, and now I'm getting in that older adult stage. But I tend to be a sleeper on a lot of things. I just don't want to go there. And yet I'm missing out on Christ shining on me. This really helps me just to think about it. That what God is doing, he's taken, this is straight from those previous verses in Ephesians, he's taking that unseen and me be making those visible. And that's what open and honest has really helped me in my human relationships. If I'm open and wise about that, and if I'm wise about being honest, those unseen things that keep tripping me up and us up over and over become visible. When things are visible, that allows for God's work in my life. And when there's God's work in our life, now we start to see the light and the life of the gospel really happening. And this verse in Proverbs is fantastic. But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn. If you just kind of close your eyes for a minute and imagine your path. If it could be like the light of dawn, it shines brighter and brighter until you get to the full day. The full day in my mind is Jesus returning. I want to be operating just brighter and brighter for the rest of my life to that full day of Jesus coming for us and taking us to heaven where everything will be visible. And as we were singing a minute ago, those verses we talked about the darkness, how did it say, ran from the grave? Or is that, how did it go? Somebody help me out here. What's that? He sent the darkness running out of the empty grave. That's what this is talking about, the darkness running out of the empty grave. And then what Kara shared, that just tied in so closely with that, with Psalm 139 and what she experienced of just God seeing the things in me where I maybe don't want to forgive. Maybe I have this. This is just being open about what's inside of me and then being honest about that as well and having those communications. So I want to ask you to look at the questions that we've talked through here. These are questions that has really helped me out. I hope that they can be helpful for you. And just ask you to take right there quietly a few moments and ask God, is there one or two things in here that he would want you to work on this week, next week? So take a moment, pray, and then I'll close us up. Abba, you are our great Father, our great Daddy. You care for us. And we thank you for that. And we come to you and just confess, I confess, that the darkness sometimes is still what I operate in. I allow it to be there in my life. And I ask you to help just to understand your life and your light and how I can, in these human relationships, with all the warts and imperfections that we have going on inside us, how I can learn to live in the truth of your gospel, how each of us here, and just give us simple ways this week to be more strong in that. In Jesus' name, amen.